Hey, it's Mrs. Gregg. Today we're going to look at Chapter 17 and talk about human health and environmental risks. And I'm going to hit the highlights of what the College Board would want you to know. So we aren't going to talk about everything. Know the difference between an infectious disease and other types of disease. So not everything is going to be caused by a pathogen. And then a pathogen, an example would be things like bacteria, viruses, different protists, different parasites. Those things can transmit disease and cause disease. Okay, and then infectious means that it can be passed from person to person or from animal to person or from parasite to person, that there's some organism that causes that disease and it can be transmitted. And then there are other types of disease, say for example heart disease, that could be caused by lifestyle choices. So do know the differences between those. If something is acute, that means that it happens pretty quickly versus something that's chronic that you would live with long term. All right, on to the types of human diseases. Roughly 3/4 of all deaths are caused by disease, and about half of that is caused by cardiovascular, cancer, and respiratory diseases. Okay, only a small portion of that is caused by infectious diseases, and those are broken out. Just kind of be familiar with what those major infectious diseases are, and we'll talk about those. Okay, on to risk factors for disease. If you are in a low-income country versus a better developed country, a more developed country, there are differences in your risk factors. If you're in a low-income country, it's poverty that's causing disease. It's access to clean drinking water, access to sanitation facilities, access to good nutrition. Whenever you don't have access to those things, you can end up with a disease. So the root of that is poverty. If you are in a more developed country, then it's lifestyle choices. We have things like high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, obesity, and that's all based on lifestyle choices. So there are two differences there, depending on how developed your country is. And then in bold here are some things that the College Board wants you to know, and that's the fact that pathogens can evolve in order to take advantage of different ways to infect and spread through a human population. So we can look at things like you can have contaminated water, you could have pathogens that are transmitted through the air, you can have pathogens in your food, you can catch people, they're community acquired diseases that you can catch from other people. You can catch things such as coronaviruses that we're seeing in the news now that can transfer from animals to humans. And then wild animals like rodents, they can carry fleas that are infected with certain pathogens and pass those on to us. So pathogens have evolved many different ways in order to infect humans. And then there are certain pathogens that are going to occur in the environment no matter how clean you are. A lot of the ones that we're going to look at are, they relate to sanitation. But some, take for example the common cold. That's out there regardless. Doesn't matter how clean you are, that's going to be out there. So not everything has to do with sanitation. On to some vocabulary you need. There's a difference between epidemic and pandemic. Right now with coronavirus, we're seeing a pandemic, so that's a worldwide situation. An epidemic is just going to be in a smaller area, but where we've seen a rapid increase in a certain disease. And then there are some diseases, certain ones that you need to be familiar with. The plague is one. If you think back to history, learning about the Middle Ages and the Black Death, that was caused by the plague. And that's caused by a bacterium that fleas transmit. So it also goes along with rodents. Rats will have the fleas, so we'll have lots of rats in an area. The fleas are on the rats, they go and bite people, and they transmit the plague to them. Malaria is another one that the College Board wants you to know. That's caused by a certain parasite that's transmitted by mosquitoes. So the mosquitoes themselves don't cause it. The mosquitoes are what we call vectors for the disease. They can carry that particular parasite, but the mosquitoes do not cause the malaria themselves. It's the parasite that's the root for malaria. The mosquitoes are just the vector. They're the thing that transmits the disease. And we see that mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. And also those who have sickle cell anemia, you may have learned in biology or maybe in middle school life science, if you have sickle cell anemia, you are conferred some resistance to malaria. So that's also why we see that in those sub-Saharan African populations. Cholera is one that you need to know, and also dysentery. Those are both caused by contaminated water. It's basically exposure to feces that's been contaminated with these bacteria in the case of cholera, or either bacteria or amoeba in the case of dysentery. So it could be from water, it could be from people who are being unclean as far as handling food. But cholera tends to be more severe than dysentery. You're both going to get diarrhea in both cases, but cholera can move to being very severe, and you end up with severe dehydration, and you can die quickly from dehydration. Dysentery, that happens all the time, even in today's society here in the United States. For instance, with babies and changing diapers, and if they have somehow picked up dysentery, or if parents are not clean with washing hands, that happens sometimes. You see that on the news with this Shigella, that people pass Shigella. But again, that causes diarrhea. But most of the time, you're seeing that in poor countries, but it can pop up in a more developed country such as ours. Tuberculosis is one, was called in the 1800s consumption, because people waste away from it. So tuberculosis, also caused by a bacterium. Whenever you cough or sneeze, if you're in close proximity to a person, you can pass that on to them if they breathe in those droplets that you have sneezed or coughed out. But it does cause you to waste away. Today we have antibiotics that will help to take care of all of these. But if we were to go back, 200 years, tuberculosis was a death sentence for you. And then also, as far as tuberculosis, it's kind of a re-emerging disease. So we have seen it re-emerge in certain populations, like here in the United States with the homeless population who aren't able to take good care of themselves, don't have access to medical care. We've seen a rise in tuberculosis in the homeless. Also, within prisons, it can spread pretty quickly because they're in close proximity to each other and also not necessarily taking good care of themselves. And then as far as an emergent disease, the definition for an emergent disease is one that hasn't been common or it's new in the past 20 years. And there are several of those that you need to be familiar with. AIDS and HIV, not covered by the College Board, neither is Ebola, but those are all emergent diseases. AIDS and HIV have been around for quite a while, so it's interesting that even though they use this definition of 2 decades for emergent infectious diseases, they're still classifying AIDS and HIV as emergent. Mad cow disease, also not covered as far as the College Board, but it's kind of interesting. In the 80s and 90s, there was an outbreak of this in the UK, and what happens is that there are certain proteins called prions or prions, depending on how you want to say it, that can be passed on from animal to animal and even from animal to person if you were to eat a cow that had been infected with these prions. And what happens is that the prions go to the brain, they're misfolded proteins, they end up causing basically holes in the brain, so you end up with a spongy brain, and there's no way to recover from that. So the cows would act crazy, hence the name mad cow disease, but if people ate meat from an infected cow, they also could pick it up. And so there were some people, 80s and 90s, who died of mad cow disease. There are people still today who, if they had eaten steak in the UK at that time, or hamburger, who aren't allowed, for instance, to give blood because of the possibility that they were subjected to those prions or prions and they're still present in their body and they just haven't done anything. Swine flu and bird flu, don't need to know. West Nile virus, you do. Also Zika. Both of those are transmitted by mosquitoes. They're both viruses. West Nile virus, we had a problem with that in the United States, I don't know, about a decade ago. You still see some emergence every now and then in the summer whenever we see these mosquito-borne diseases pop up and the mosquitoes are out. With West Nile, you would have probably like flu-type symptoms, but it is related to birds, so you'll see West Nile in birds, and it can be transmitted from birds to people. Zika virus, that one was in the news a couple of years ago. With the problem there is that children are born with microcephaly. So they have these small heads and they end up with brain damage because of the small head. That also is caused by an infected mosquito transmitting that virus. Lyme disease is no longer covered. You're probably familiar with that one. It's transmitted by ticks. That one can be taken care of with antibiotics if you catch it fast enough. And then we're on to coronaviruses, which is timely considering the events right now. Coronaviruses have been around for ever, and there are probably hundreds of different coronaviruses, and they reside in animals and birds. But then some of them are what we call zoonotic, meaning that they can transmit, they can pass from an animal to a human. Most of the time, animal viruses stay within animals, can't pass that to humans, just like human viruses can't pass to animals. But occasionally there's some that can jump across species. And so there are some coronaviruses that have done that. There are 7 that we know of that will infect people, and 4 of them cause common cold. So not a big problem. But then there are 3 of them that have more recently jumped into the human population. And the College Board does want you to be familiar with MERS and SARS. So MERS is Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. They think it probably originated in camels. And if you're living in close contact with camels, then they can pass that virus on to humans. And hence the Middle East name. That's where it was first originated. And we first saw that in 2012. That one has an extremely high mortality rate. You're going to have respiratory illness more severe than what we're seeing with the current coronavirus. That one has a high mortality rate. There is SARS. That's a little bit older. That one originated in China. We think probably from bats. That one also causes respiratory problems. Only its mortality rate is better than what we see with the MERS. It's a 10% mortality rate. And then we're up to the COVID-19 that we're seeing right now. It's related. It's a SARS virus. It's related to the original SARS, and so it has that 2 designation, so they are genetically related, but this one is not nearly as fatal as what we saw with the original SARS, and we aren't entirely sure where that one came from. They've talked about bats, and they have talked about some type of an anteater most recently that's native to China, but they're still looking for the origin with that one. So as we look forward, what kinds of challenges are there as far as human health? If we're talking about those low-income countries, as we move them out of poverty and get them towards clean drinking water, better sanitation, better nutrition, then we'll see improvement as far as human health there. In high-income countries such as ours, we've got to make better lifestyle choices. We've got to exercise, eat correctly, make sure that we aren't overeating, make sure that we're eating the right stuff, and then limit tobacco use. All of those things will improve health in developed countries. And then, of course, education always helps, and particularly with things such as HIV or tuberculosis that are passed from person to person pretty easily. A special note, this comes straight off the College Board's information, is that as we see climate change and as we see those warmer climates move further north, if we're talking about the northern hemisphere, or move further south in the southern hemisphere, as we're seeing expansion of those equatorial type climate zones, we're also going to see an expansion of the diseases that typically go along with that, say like malaria, things where insects are spreading disease and they like those warmer temperatures. Anywhere any type of mosquito-borne disease is going to expand, go further north and further south. But as we see climate change, we're going to see an expand of the diseases that go along with warmer climates. And that leaves us with, we're on to toxicology. You have a list of toxic substances that you have composed. You need to be familiar with those. Most of those are on here. 2 that are pointed out by the College Board is asbestos can cause a type of lung cancer called mesothelioma. You may have seen the commercials on the TV with the lawyers about mesothelioma lawsuits. So that's caused by exposure to asbestos. And then the other one that the College Board points out as far as chemicals that you can be exposed to that cause problems would be ozone, that you can have respiratory problems from exposure to tropospheric ozone. Classifying chemicals, neurotoxins, things like lead and mercury, they're going to affect your brain function or your nervous system function. We have carcinogens that cause cancer, mutagens that will cause damage to the genetic material in a cell. It does not necessarily have to be a chemical. Things like ultraviolet light, if you go out, if you're exposed to too much sunlight without proper protection, then you can end up having problems with skin cancer. That's basically because that ultraviolet light has caused a mutation in your skin cells. And then there are things called teratogens. Teratogens are chemicals that will interfere with the normal development of a fetus. A famous teratogen was thalidomide. So thalidomide was prescribed to women in the late 50s, 60s to control nausea whenever morning sickness when they were pregnant. And that was not thoroughly tested in pregnant women. And it turned out that a lot of the women who took that their fetuses had developmental problems. The babies were born missing limbs. So you may have heard about thalidomide babies before. And that was an example of a teratogen, something that caused an interference in the normal development of the fetus. There are allergens that we're having problems with right now, all the pollen in the air. Endocrine disruptors, those are things that can mimic hormones or they can alter the normal production of hormones in a person or an animal's body. We saw that with the Chesapeake Bay, that there were fish who became feminized, male fish who became feminized, who ended up producing eggs, and that was the result of being exposed to different endocrine disruptors. Part of that would be pharmaceuticals that pass through people's bodies out of their urine and into the wastewater stream, and it's difficult for wastewater treatment plants to remove those things. So there are lots of endocrine disruptors that are out there that we really have no good way to get them out of our bodies of water. You need to be familiar with dose response studies. And again, we have this acute and chronic. Acute would be short duration and chronic is long term. So a dose response study looks at how an organism will respond to a particular dose of chemical. This is just a generic dose response curve. So you have the dose of the chemical, and this is on the logarithmic scale down here, and then you have the percent effect. Percent effect does not always have to be death. Percent effect could be maybe tumor induction. Does it cause tumors? Or here we have a tissue response for a particular dose of chemical. So it does not always have to involve death. If we are looking specifically at mortality, though, we can look at the LD50. So here's another dose response curve. This one, we have the dose along the x-axis, we have mortality here, and we can find 50% mortality, come along here and figure out what dose causes a 50% death rate in organisms. The problem with LD50 studies a lot of times is they do them on rats, and are rats necessarily a perfect model for what might happen with a human being? So that's not an ideal situation for doing those LD50 studies. Let's see. Synergistic interactions. It can be the case that two chemicals can interact in a person or an animal's body in a different way and cause a more severe response than the individual chemicals themselves. So because of that, it can be difficult sometimes to exactly determine a cause for certain effects. So whenever people maybe have developed cancer, it may be difficult to exactly pinpoint exactly what particular environmental exposure caused that cancer, because we are exposed to so many different things. And also with the synergistic effects, some things may exacerbate. If you get 2 or 3 or 4 different chemicals in your body, it may exacerbate the effects of all of them, make it all worse. So it's difficult to exactly pinpoint what the root cause of certain cancers or certain diseases is, given that we are exposed to so many different things and we don't know the synergistic effects. Let's see, there are different routes of exposure. All of these things. There are pollutants in our air, pollutants in our water. There are things that contaminate our food, say pesticides that are on food. There are contaminants in soil. So again, it's difficult to determine exactly how you may have been exposed to certain chemicals. And then if you are a baby, anything that your mother is exposed to can affect you when you're in the womb as a fetus. Know that a lot of these chemicals can be fat soluble, and if they are fat soluble, then they tend to accumulate in organisms' bodies. They will also bind to soils, and so fat soluble things are not going to be found in water, but they will bind to soils, and so you may find them in the bottoms of bodies of water collected there. And then that brings us to bioaccumulation and biomagnification. We've talked about those before. So bioaccumulation is an increased concentration in an individual's body over time. You might eat something and it accumulates in your fat tissues. Maybe you're exposed to, maybe you were 50 years old and you were around whenever DDT was still being used. So DDT was banned in 1972. So maybe you were around before 1972 and exposed to DDT on your produce, or maybe when they were spraying for mosquitoes in your neighborhood. So that DDT can accumulate in the fat tissues in your body. Now let's kind of drop back and say that we're spraying DDT in the environment. All of the creatures in the environment, let's say that we're in a pond. The creatures in the pond are exposed to the DDT. So everything from the phytoplankton all the way up to the different types of fish in the pond, they're all exposed to DDT. As we're moving up the food chain, as we go up the higher trophic levels, those things that are a higher trophic level are accumulating more and more DDT because of the organisms that they have eaten that are in that food chain underneath them at the lower trophic levels. So maybe a little bit of DDT in the phytoplankton doesn't hurt it. Maybe a little bit of DDT in the minnows that are eating the phytoplankton, not enough to kill them. And then we have bigger fish that are eating the minnows, even bigger fish that are eating the big fish. We get all the way up to the apex predators. Those fish, now they have accumulated all of that DDT that was in the organisms in the food chain underneath them. We see a big problem with that with eagles and birds of prey. In the 70s, we saw a huge decline in eagles, and they actually went onto the endangered list because of the exposure. Well, for one, there's habitat destruction, but also there was exposure to DDT. And then after 1972, once we banned the use of DDT in the United States, because it's so persistent, it hangs around for a very long time. It can last for 30 years in the soil. Because that DDT is persistent, it was not until 2007 that the bald eagles came off the endangered list. So it took quite a while for the bald eagle population to recover. And what happened with the DDT was it thinned their eggshells, the eagle's eggshells, so that when the mama eagle came to nest and sat on the eggshells, it would crush them. So the babies couldn't be hatched. You can talk about the persistence of a certain chemical in the environment, how long it remains in the environment, and it just depends on the type of chemical. So again, DDT can last for quite a long time in the soil, but then other things such as malathion, which is an insecticide, use that to kill mosquitoes, but it only lasts a day. Its half-life is a day in the environment. So you'd have to spray that one pretty frequently if you're keeping the mosquito population down with that. That is one that's currently used. But DDT was really effective because it would persist. It would stay in the environment for quite some time. All right, and then last thing, risk analysis. There's not a whole lot about risk analysis as far as what the College Board is concerned. The biggest thing you need to know is that people sometimes overestimate the risk of certain things. So for instance, you might have people who say, I am never going to fly in an airplane because they fall out of the sky. Well, the risk of you, the probability of you dying in an airplane accident would be 1 in 9,821 versus the probability of you dying from heart disease or cancer is 1 in 7. If you think back to whenever we're learning about energy sources, people are so afraid of nuclear. The risk of dying in a nuclear accident is something like 1 in a billion. And so people tend to overestimate certain risks. That's basically what you need to know as far as risk assessment. What else? It's probably good to know about these two principles. There's the innocent until proven guilty principle when regarding using certain chemicals in the environment, that we're going to consider that chemical is safe until we see a problem with it. That's one idea or one approach to certain potential toxins. The other is called the precautionary principle, which we're going to treat it as there's probably something wrong with it and test it out before we actually use it in the environment. So those are two different approaches to managing risk. And then something that might be good to be familiar with is the Stockholm Convention, that there are 12 chemicals that they have looked at banning or phasing out or reducing. For instance, DDT is one of them that's listed on there. And that is it. I hope that helped, and I will see you next time. Bye.